Hi, everyone. I'm Bill Squadron, President of Our Energy Policy, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar on critical mineral supply chains. This is part of a broader program that the Earthshot Foundation and Our Energy Policy are undertaking throughout the course of the year on this really essential issue of critical minerals and their role in the energy transition and all of the different elements associated with it. In fact, we will be posting first white paper to come out of this program on national security issues associated with critical minerals on the OEP website within the next day or so. I would encourage all of you to have a look at that as well. But thank you for joining us for this conversation today. We have an outstanding group of panelists that will be digging into the issue of supply chain. I want to thank all of our partners, by the way, for supporting the work that OEP does. But in particular, our co-host and a partner in this Critical Minerals Monologue series, the Earthshot Foundation. One thing I want to point out to everyone in the audience, in the last part of the hour, we'll be taking your questions. So please write them and submit them through the chat opportunity, and we will get to as many of your questions as we can before the end of the hour. So let's jump right in. I'm going to introduce our moderator today, Adam Simon. Adam is a professor of Earth and Environmental Sciences at the University of Michigan. He is one of the nation's experts on critical mineral and mineral resources. He's written 2 textbooks on this topic, undertaken extensive research. He's a fellow at the Society of Economic Geologists, so we're very fortunate to have Adam with us today moderating this discussion. And I'm going to turn it over to Adam to introduce our panelists and get the discussion going.
Thank you very much, Bill. I'm happy to be here to help moderate this discussion. And I'll start off by giving a brief intro of our 3 panelists. Abigail Hunter is Executive Director of SAFE's Ambassador Alfred Hoffman Jr. Center for Critical Minerals Strategy. She was previously the Director of International Affairs and Partnerships within the Minerals Center. Todd Malan is Chief External Affairs Officer and Head of Climate Strategy at Talon Metals, a publicly traded mineral resource company focused on discovery and development of high-grade nickel deposits in the Lake Superior region of the United States. And Zach Valdez is Advisor to the Office of Manufacturing and Energy Supply Chains. Previously, he served in the role as Chief of Staff. And prior to joining DOE, Dr. Valdez developed strategy for diversity, equity, inclusion, and future workforce policy at the Office of Advanced Manufacturing within the National Institutes of Science and Technology. So, Todd, I'll start with you. You work for a publicly traded company. Your company is focused on increasing domestic supply of nickel, cobalt, and copper. We can't build battery electric vehicles or wind turbines or solar panels without those metals. Can you give us your perspective on where the United States is for being able to secure a domestic supply of those minerals?
Yeah, you bet, Adam. Thank you so much. And really happy to be here and looking forward to this discussion with the panel and folks' questions. I mean, I think we're at basically an inflection point. I mean, you've got extraordinary mechanisms of support now for a secure supply chain and extraordinary support for the energy transition. In the IRA, in the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, in the Defense Production Act. It's a bit confusing sometimes, and it's almost an alphabet soup that you have to sort through with all the acronyms, but it's a very tasty soup. You know, we're fortunate enough that we're focused on the idea that there's more high-grade nickel in America. We're following up on a 1997 paper from the U.S. Geological Survey that basically said that the mid-continent rift geology of the United States was highly prospective for high-grade nickel at district scale, similar to what Sudbury has in Canada, the Norlist deposits in Russia, and Nova Bollinger in Australia. And so that's what we're trying to do. And we're fortunate enough that we were able to get funding from the bipartisan infrastructure law for our processing and refinery, and also funding from the Department of Defense for mineral exploration. But, you know, the bottom line is China still dominates a lot of the production of these vital materials for clean energy systems on a global basis. They're controlling the flow of these materials, and in some cases, they're able to control the price. And that's really important because what they can do is actually undermine the economics of projects outside of China's influence. And that's one of the things that we're going to have to struggle with amongst the US, Australia, Canada, and other allies. So yes, we've got great resources. Yes, we've got some helpful policies, but it's going to take more and a more focused effort to be able to have security of supply as we push forward in the clean energy transition, and to make sure that we're not reliant on countries that could be adversaries for defense platforms. And that's another aspect of this national security angle with you and your colleagues have really called out as well in your work. So it's a journey. We're well along on that journey. There's going to be some ups and downs, but I'm quite hopeful about where we're at.
So Zach, let me jump to you. You know, anyone who follows news from the Department of Energy and subscribes to Secretary Granholm's Twitter feed, we get a lot of really good news on almost an hourly basis most days of the week. And most of the news focuses on downstream manufacture of renewable energy technologies, increasing domestic production of batteries for electric vehicles, increasing domestic production of semiconductors and solar panels and wind turbines. Can you give us a sense of what's happening at DOE as you try to balance your focus on downstream manufacturing with the need for upstream production of all of the critical minerals from mines?
Yeah, Adam, that's a great question, and I appreciate being on here. I would say, you know, you're right, because I think traditionally what DOE has done is focused on that R&D spectrum, right? We're not focused on how we get all the materials we need to make it. We just want to be able to make it, and then we'll scale it. But I think what we've defined is to manufacture things in this country, and to build on what Todd was saying is to increase that security. We really need those upstream resources. And so what we've done is we've built onto an analytical backbone that identifies where strategically in the various technologies supply chain can we resource those materials. And at DOE, we don't technically do any of the mining sector. We help with some of the technology and some of the frameworks for it, but DOE doesn't generally fund strictly mining outside of maybe some LPO things on the outskirts. But what we've found is, one, do we have the resources? And two, do we have the capability? And so where we have those, that's where we think it's strategic for us to invest now. And I think what you've seen through the policies of this administration is we want to get to the point where we can essentially build the resource capability and capacity in this country. And so we're creating certain ways in which we're providing more opportunity for Americans to receive resources from US companies. So I think it's going to take a while, but what we've done in this first part is just build out this analytical framework that says, here are the strategic resources and capabilities that DOE should invest in with this unprecedented funding through Bill, IRA, and CHIPS. And once we invest in that, we can then do another reassessment and identify, you know, where do we need more, where do we need less. But I think it really goes back to what Todd was saying is, I was in a panel yesterday and they said, you know, why is developing upstream security and supply chain resilience important? And it shocks me as like, well, you know, in the 70s when we relied on one general region for oil and gas, and they said, you know what, we don't agree with something you did, and we're no longer going to support you. That sort of sprungboard things in biofuels and clean energy, and for us to look at our own energy resources. And I think The unfortunate part of this is we're a little bit late to the party in really developing that upstream technology, but I have faith that the American industry can really innovate on this and find solutions.
Thanks. So Abigail, let me ask you a question. You're someone who has expertise making observations of how private industry works, how government works. What do you see are the opportunities for the federal government, state governments, and industry to come together and partner to increase upstream supply of critical minerals?
It's a great question. I like the inclusion of state government there because I got my start in Washington, D.C. working for the National Governors Association and most previously worked for a province. So appreciate the role of the states, provinces, and other jurisdictions and contributing to that. I think right now, we actually did a local ecosystem roundtable on this subject last year. SAFE did, that Todd attended, and some of Zach's colleagues at DOE attended, really trying to navigate how states were ushering in the investment that the IRA and the BIL really have facilitated, and then where they can be most strategic in helping make sure that's coupled effectively with private sector investment. I think the complexities of these supply chains is definitely something new as they're trying to take advantage of being the salespeople for the states and making sure that they're bringing in those dollars, creating those jobs. And so state-federal collaboration, which we've seen the Biden-Harris administration definitely lean in to do, has been really critical to making sure they understand kind of what's in that incentive package. What are the guardrails to the extent that you have the FEOC provisions, the foreign entity of control provisions within certain of those incentives, and then making sure they understand kind of the connectivity of the supply chain. I think, looking to what Zach alluded to on what's the next phase of this is how do these really impressive investments across the supply chain fit together, and then where are the gaps? We have $128 billion of private investment that's gone into battery, cell, and module in production in the United States since 2018. But is that kind of following the right investments in the cathode active material, the anode active material, and before that, the precursors that go into that really help incentivize companies like Todd's have that, full supply chain value and see that created, in the United States and with maybe our North American partners. And making sure that if there is some unalignment there, that we're trying to support those other nodes as much as we can, I think will be the big next phase for companies, states, and governments in the federal level.
So Todd, let me come back to you. When we think about the production of nickel, if we stick with just nickel for now, there's a lot in the news about child labor in the DRC, and we'll come back to that topic. But one of the things that battery manufacturers have been doing over the last few years to try and reduce the dependence on cobalt from the DRC is increasing the proportion of nickel in electric vehicle batteries. If we look at nickel production, it's dominated by Indonesia, the Philippines, and New Caledonia. So when you wake up in the morning in Washington, D.C., and the headline indicates political unrest in New Caledonia, which has the potential to disrupt nearly 10% of the global nickel supply, how does that translate to nickel mining in the United States? The speed with which Talon Metals and other companies could actually ramp up mine development to make up for what is in reality a very fragile supply chain. And we see this happening in the last few months in New Caledonia, and we've also seen this happening in the Philippines and Indonesia.
Yeah, great question. I mean, it really is a matter of geology. I don't know whether I have the same view on where the production comes on. There's great nickel resources in Canada. There's great nickel resources in Australia. Europe has a capability in nickel. And you got to remember that, nickel is used in steel as an alloy material in stainless steel. So some low-grade deposits actually are tracking into that stainless steel supply chain. And it takes quite a bit of energy oftentimes to refine it to get down to the level of battery grade material. So you see the capability to produce that battery grade in places like Canada and in Australia. So I wouldn't count out those other producers where they have more sulfide ores that have higher concentrations. What we have here in Minnesota is, I got a little show and tell here. I think I don't know whether my cam is gonna respond to this, but this is 12% nickel and 16% copper. I mean, you're the geologist, but it's shiny coming out of the ground. We've got an amazing resource. And the reason that people should care about high grade is that it means that you can do a much more surgical underground mining method that has less disturbance of the earth than low-grade laterite deposits, which tend to be equatorial and that require basically massive open pit mines scraping the top 150, 200 feet of topsoil off. And then that has an impact on rainforests because you've got to lose the rainforest. In Indonesia, you see riverine and ocean disposal of waste tailings. And then you have to take a ton of coal-fired energy in Indonesia and actually concentrate that material so that it can be in stainless steel or in batteries. In comparison to what we can produce in Australia, Canada, or the US from this high grill, the CO2 footprint of Indonesian nickel is 50, 60 times. And that is, I think we all have to be conscious, especially in the clean energy supply chain, that as we're trying to address climate change by transitioning to clean energy systems and electric vehicle transportation, we also have to be aware of what our other impacts are on the environment. And so I think that's a big thing that we're going to have to grapple with. And what I also think is really important, we have to recall that what we want to take out of the ground or can take out of the ground in Minnesota, hopefully responsibly, is infinitely recyclable. So the context of disturbing the earth for materials like nickel is different than disturbing the earth than for oil and gas. And we have to be simultaneously working on producing more material responsibly and contributing that to future generations' ability to have a circular economy, at the same time that we're making sure that we're building great recycling systems so that those future generations actually can have more and more of a circular system.
Yeah, you bring up a good point. I meet with a lot of people who think we can recycle our way through the energy transition. And eventually that's going to be the case, but it's in the next century. We've still got to mine the quantity of nickel, copper, cobalt, lithium needed to build a new renewable energy infrastructure. So let me just do a quick follow-up. Can you give us a quick timeline on the chronology of your project in Minnesota, from the date it was discovered to the date that you anticipate producing nickel that you can hold in your hand and sell to Tesla and other companies?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's long. I mean, the Eureka moment was 15 years ago for the discovery that there's a significant resource there. And there's been a lot of work to do exploration and characterize that deposit. We've now submitted the mine plan for the state of Minnesota's environmental review process, which is the first part of the permitting process in the state of Minnesota. We have an offtake agreement with Tesla, and that offtake agreement has us producing nickel by 2028. It's going to be very tight. We have to rely on the state of Minnesota having a process that works at pace. We don't want to cut any corners. We actually have a great process that actually involves the state regulators and tribal sovereign governments in this initial phase. Then there'll be a public comment period. And ultimately, we want to try to be in production by 2028. But discovery, delineation, mine design, and then permitting is a long process. There's ways that we can make it more efficient, and we can do it more efficiently, but we can't cut corners because we need to have the public have confidence that the mining industry can do things differently, and it doesn't have to be a choice between the ingredients we need for the clean energy transition and the natural environment that people want to rely on and enjoy and is culturally important to indigenous people.
Can I jump in here, Adam, quickly?
Yeah,
Just
absolutely, Abigail, please.
first to emphasize that your question to Todd about the article metaphor here is very appropriate, because I'm on the receiving end of every one of those articles that Todd sees, just to make sure we're tracking all of this. So very appropriate. But I really want to emphasize on the point of, the fact that a lot of this nickel today is going towards stainless steel, but we'll see a displacement towards nickel sulfate going for the battery chemistry, the battery grade nickel going to displace stainless steel for demand in terms of why we're producing as much nickel at I think the end of the decade, so around 2030. And the fact that the Indonesian nickel is produced, within a process that is far more energy intensive, and then utilizing coal, which is the predominant energy resource that they have on the archipelago, that's going to necessarily, and that's expected where the world's going to be continue to get its nickel based on IEA projections. So we and ourselves, in trying to support the clean energy transition and trying to get vehicles on roads, are a demand source for that nickel that is produced in that manner, right? And so you have folks in the administration that are really focused narrowly on trying to get Indonesia to have a different energy mix, trying to get off coal as much as possible. But then we're also, trying to usher in the need for nickel in the form of these batteries. And so squaring kind of that kind of dynamic, I think, is going to be really important for us going forward, because there's a really important interconnection between why they're utilizing the degree of captive coal at local levels in Indonesia to be able to produce this for the rest of the world, and where it's going. And so making sure that we're working, with producers all over the world that Todd's listed is going to be really important, but then also working with the Indonesian government, eyes wide open of, why they're using the coal to be able to, transition their energy mix. And that's going to take a really long time. It's hard to build transmission lines and access geothermal there, right? But it's just making sure that we're being mindful of kind of our part in both sides of this on the demand side.
Yeah, but don't you think it's also an issue, Abigail, that predominant production of nickel in Indonesia is by Chinese companies, and that brings in that security aspect as well. And I think that, if we want to have an independent, secure supply chain, I think we have to think about not only the standards of production, but who's doing the work.
I want to pick up on this because it's a great point. And Abigail, just to take it a step further, one of the things that we often don't think about is in the United States, Canada, the European Union, we're talking about a transition from internal combustion engines, which took over 100 years ago, to battery electric vehicles. I spend a lot of time traveling to less developed countries where what I get asked is, when are we going to transition from no energy to energy? We don't have refrigerators. We don't have electricity. We can't build hospitals. We can't build education systems. And we know without any doubt that as you increase access to energy in any form around the world, that improves every possible social and economic indicator. So one of the things that often gets left out here, and it touches on the point Todd made, is the United States has a really important role to play in less developed countries, making sure that the supply chains actually lead to economic improvement in those countries. Whether it's parts of Indonesia or the Philippines or the DRC, that's something that we often don't think about. We look at Africa, which is going to double in population from 1 billion to 2 billion over the next 75 years. And right now, the entire continent of Africa has 60 million vehicles. In the United States, we buy 20 million new vehicles every single year. So we're also here thinking about not just the energy transition for us, but capacity building in less developed countries. Abigail, what do we need to do to make sure that the energy transition here does benefit people in rural parts of the world that are supplying the metals we use?
This is a really, really important question. And, in the questions we were kind of looking over and prep for this discussion, one of them was kind of the ethical considerations of where we're getting these materials, which is part of what you're getting at. And I think going back to the DRC example you were alluding to earlier, 70% of the world's cobalt comes from the Democratic Republic of Congo right now. But we've seen, because of the rising consciousness around child labor in those supply chains, that you've shifted a battery chemistry actually away from having as much cobalt and actually having more nickel, so that you can decrease your exposure to that part of the supply chain. But in the African context, 20 of the countries, 20% of their exports, or 25% of their exports, is actually the extractive sector. And so this is really important for their economic development. Energy can further unlock that, not only in justifying access to these commodities, these assets that maybe are uninvestable right now, but also can help them develop down the supply chain, which we've heard from many, many resource-rich nations that they want to see. They see the ability for them to refine, to smelt, to further process, and eventually, to the extent that they can, get to, in the battery context, the CAM, the AM, the gigafactories that we were talking to at the beginning of the conversation. That is not possible without energy. We took a delegation to the Democratic Republic of Congo and to Zambia last year, and we brought one of the gentlemen who set up the first Panasonic gigafactory to kind of explain what it takes from an energy perspective to have that product line be, as secure as possible. This is advanced manufacturing. You cannot have the lights going out. And that is exactly what happened in one of the hotels we were in Lusaka and in Kinshasa. And so we have an opportunity through existing programs like Power Africa, Prosper Africa, in the US context, but then also certainly with our allies, to make sure that we're creating the accompanying investments in the energy systems that will then allow them to be able to support their resource development to our benefit, but certainly to their benefit, which should be the priority.
So Zach, let's jump to you, and I'll ask if you can comment on what are the technologic innovations that are exciting? Where do you see technology advancing over the next 5 to 10 years that is going to change the supply chains for critical minerals, prioritize nickel versus cobalt, prioritize salt batteries versus lithium-ion batteries? What do you see happening in that space that gives you a good sense of optimism over the rest of this current decade that we're going to make progress mitigating our impacts on climate?
Yeah, I would say I would say it's even upstream of that, and we're looking at the mining space, right? And how can we think about decarbonizing the mining space, or being more surgical in terms of how we're mining and what we're mining? You, Adam, as an economic geologist, I went to, my PhD was in geoscience, and so using qualitative measurements to identify rocks and lithographies was something, as an engineer, that just drove me crazy. I'm like, can we put numbers on things? Can we quantify things? So I think there's a push there to use data. We have so much data on our hands now to find out better ways to identify and isolate resources. I think from a technology standpoint, we're really looking at what are the ways that we can get the same amount of charge, in the case of EVs, the same amount of distance, with the same amount of recharge going through these processes. And so one of the things that we're looking at is, how do we leverage our national labs with some of the smartest people in this country, really to help work with industry to say, hey, you've got a battery design idea. We're thinking about how do we build test cases or test pods in these national labs, so that you want to try a new battery. Here's a new place where it can be third-party validated, because ultimately what we want to do at the Department of Energy is support these efforts, these industry-led efforts. But where we're running into spaces, somebody comes to me and say, hey, Zach, I've got the best new battery design in the world, and we've tested it, and it's done this. And I'm like, who's tested it beside your company? And they're like, well, why, who needs to test it besides us? And I'm like, well, we've got these great national labs, or like what third-party vendors. And so I think that's when it comes to how do we build the surrounding resources and services so that when these new technologies do come to fruition, they have somewhere in a third party. That way the US government and public tax dollars are invested in a solid technology.
Yeah, Zach, just to stick with that topic for a minute, I'm generally aware of programs through the Department of Energy where academics and people in private industry can essentially, my characterization, rent time at national labs and rent access to, as you said, some of the smartest people in the world working at the national labs. Can you give our callers, can you give our viewers a sense of, what are the programs through DOE that people can take advantage of that would allow them to access the brain power?
Yeah, so the one that comes immediately to mind, especially with the academic and lab folks, is the Technology Transfer Office, where they're looking at how do we get to commercialization, and they're a really good mechanism to showcase we've got some cool R&D, we want to commercialize it, what is the process that we need to do to get to that? So oftentimes they'll leverage the national labs. But I think leveraging what DOE used to be, which is whether it be Vehicle Technology Office, or even the Office of Electricity, they're really looking at how do they take that R&D and fund it. And oftentimes when you're getting funded by DOE, it's a great introduction into the national labs. So that's another one. The other one is looking at prizes. We're constantly looking at small prizes to integrate people into the DOE infrastructure. And I think as we do that, one of the things that the secretary keeps saying is we want to see something go from basic science. So that's looking at, your bar napkin drawings going from innovation to application. So now you're in the lab and you're tinkering it, and then it's going to commercialization. I think we have all the different offices for that. And we just need to do a better job of showcasing what that looks like and providing people those resources.
So Todd, let me come back to you. Todd, you want to jump in there?
Yeah, do you mind if I just give a couple examples? I think Zach really hit something on the head, which is one of the ways I get asked a lot, like, well, how are we going to compete with China? And I think the knowledge and the capability of scientists in the United States, whether they're in the national lab system, whether they're at universities, or whether they're entrepreneurial companies, is one of the keys to our ability to innovate and then enhance our competitiveness. Just to give you one example, I have been working with Argonne National Lab on a new approach to basically reprocessing a legacy WEGS product in nickel production that would allow us to actually remove the iron that would have normally gone to the waste pile, and those iron compounds could then be used in a different type of battery technology, LFP battery technology, which uses lithium and iron, special types of iron. And so what this would do, and I call this sort of full value mining, basically trying to get as much juice out of the orange that you can, not putting things into the waste, reducing waste, but on a battery per ton of ore out of the ground, if we're supplying two different battery chemistries, the nickel and the iron-based battery chemistries, we think that with this Argonne partnership, we can increase our ratio of batteries per ton of rock by 4 times. So again, initial basic research, we have to scale it, but the initial results have been pretty impressive. And it's those sort of things, like thinking of new ways to do things, that I think is going to help us to leapfrog over some of the Chinese technology and do things differently.
Yeah,
It also brings some credibility for investors too, to see these experts in the government supporting these projects. And again, these are hefty price tags affiliated with these projects. And not a lot of knowledge or existing capital has gone into these supply chains domestically, but we're, ripe for capital in the United States. But you're lacking LPs that have an understanding of spherical graphite, right? And so when you can bring in the expertise of a national lab and that endorsement, in addition to, ideally, if you can get it, the support of the DOE through these many grants and programs, you'll start to hopefully see in that simultaneous ushering in of the private money that all of this is designed to invigorate.
Right. And just to follow up on that, make a quick point. You know, when we talk about reprocessing mine waste, you know, again, a lot of people, I think, misunderstand how much value that potentially has for the upstream supply chain. Freeport-McMoRan made an announcement recently. They're one of the world's leading copper producers, that by reprocessing waste, they anticipate being able to produce somewhere on the order of 500,000 tons of copper per year, which is somewhere on the order of about 1/40th of global supply. So that's going to be extremely important moving forward. Zach.
Well, and we've got two projects right now at the demonstration scale, funded through DOE, one in West Virginia and I think one in South Dakota, I believe, looking at just that, looking at tailings and mine waste and how do we pull out rare earth elements from this. And that's just one of those things where surely we have the innovation in this country. How does the government sort of seed and de-risk a lot of the investment to get that to commercialization? And so we consistently want to see that process happen. Obviously realizing that it has to go through certain steps, but the other thing is realizing that there's a certain sense of change management happening in terms of what supply chains are looking at. So we've traditionally, we've kind of already gone through this, but we go through the cheapest cost, and we're realizing that through the pandemic, maybe our supply chains are not as quite secure as we'd like them. And so we're having to reroute and identify what's important to find domestic resources or nearshore or fringe shore. And what do we have to go outside of that space? But part of that is also us looking internal to the United States and saying, where are there existing resources that we have traditionally left behind because the value wasn't there? And so I think DOE is consistently looking at, we're Department of Energy, but we're also looking at climate and natural resources. And so how do we use the resources that are already available in a sustainable way to maintain and to push towards the climate goals that we have?
So Todd, I'll ask you a question here with respect to the minerals production side of things. What do mining companies need to do to improve discovery rates? One of the things we know that de-risks exploration is having some sense of certainty for price. So if nickel is 18,000 per ton or 19,000 per ton, mining companies have been putting a lot of money into exploration. And honestly, I think you are probably the only company in the US in the last decade who have you've made an announcement of a major discovery. There's a lot of venture capital going into funding a variety of startups that promise that using AI is going to make discoveries. They've announced nothing. You know, to my understanding, not a single one of these companies who've raised, some of them in excess of $1 billion, have made a single discovery. So what does the mining industry need? What investment needs to be there?
It's a great question. And, you know, one of the things that we have done, which was sort of happenstance, it was a consequence of COVID. Normally what you would do is have, you know, a geologist in a junior mining company, and then they would go out and hire independent drilling companies to go do the drilling, independent geophysical consultants. We ran into a problem with COVID where everybody shut down. And so our leadership decided, let's put some money on the table and kind of bet the farm and try and do it and bring it in-house. So we bought drill rigs, we brought people in and hired drillers and drill helpers and brought our geophysics in-house. That actually had a big impact for us. We've improved our rates of discovery and drilling accuracy because people are all on the same team. They're not being parsed out to different projects and moving around. So it's actually been a pretty interesting journey for us to just discover that actually having an in-house team really has improved outcomes. And I think that's in part why the Department of Defense gave us $20 million to try and find more nickel in America. In terms of general investment parameters, you know, I do think that the investment community is a little slow on the uptake to understand that area, that discovery moment, that is an area where you're going to see the highest, return on investment. That if people are willing to take the risk and learn about the mineral exploration process and back some of these folks that are coming out of big companies or are coming with innovative approaches to new ways of discovery, that's where they're going to see the highest return on investment is if we can find some new discoveries, if we can, there is some money. I've seen some recent funding for people that are looking at older mines and repurposing them or doing waste recovery. But we do need the financial community to rise to the occasion, not just manufacturing and the mining sector. We need some new capital to come in and take some risk.
Yeah, I mean, I think we need some breakthroughs, right? I mean, if we think about how we have made mineral discoveries going back to the Stone Age, we literally would see minerals on the surface of the earth, gold, silver, and copper that are written into the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible. And that method worked through the 20th century, doesn't work anymore. We have found all of those deposits. So now we need some sort of modern technology that in essence gives us X-ray vision into the subsurface to discover new mineral deposits. So I know we want to leave time for questions, but Abigail, I want to finish with you here. So my wife and I, we co-parented 4 kids, and I was in the DRC last summer for several weeks trying to really understand the artisanal supply chain for cobalt. And we met with people in every possible role in that artisanal supply chain. And with every person I met, every one of them made a really good case for the fact that in most places in that area of the southern DRC, their options are either to barely subsist because there is no unemployment insurance, there is no Medicare, there's no Medicaid, there's no social net whatsoever that the government will provide. So the options are you literally hunt and kill and eat the things that you can find, or you artisanally mine. And it reminded me of my own ancestors coming over on ships from Ireland and moving to Western Pennsylvania, where when I've looked at their immigration cards, they either became coal miners or in the 20th century worked in the steel industry. So what can be done to formalize the artisanal mining supply chain so that we actually look at human beings and treat them as humans and give them agency in this process?
Easy question. I think it's really, really important, and I hope folks on this webinar, if you didn't already know that listening in, like that's a really important thing I think to emphasize, because we treat this area as like a binary where we think it's just innately bad. And so then again, as I mentioned before, we shift chemistries to avoid exposure of a specific commodity. Or, we say we're going to mine elsewhere, and then we leave these people whose livelihoods are dependent on the access to artisanal mining in the lurch. And that is not a solution, right? That is not what we want to see happening. I know that if I'm correct, I believe I'm correct that when we went out there, it was actually the Zambian government that was pushing for kind of more traceability of these supply chains and trying to actively, on the artisanal side, to actively showcase, doing it safely and not necessarily undermining the ability of people to work in that way. I can't speak for whether the DRC government has supported something of that nature, but I do think that the ability to kind of formalize to the extent possible, especially with these major mining companies in those jurisdictions, those practices, and make sure that they're done as safely as possible would probably be kind of top of mind. But as Todd alluded to before, it's not Western investors that are the biggest ones in this space. Chinese investors in the DRC displaced Glencore as the largest cobalt producers in the world last year. And they don't necessarily share our priorities to kind of export our values and ensure that standards are enshrined in our practices, either out of, compulsory nature because of the regulations that we hold them to, or just kind of reflection of values and work. And so if we're absent from the conversation, if we are not actually investing in these mining projects and our companies are not engaged, and we don't have a lot of major mining companies in the US context, our allies in Australia and the UK are they have headquartered of a lot of those companies as well. So I think it's really important that we're trying to kind of collaborate with our allies to see where we can not only usher in the investment, but then, bring with them the standards that we hold dear.
Yeah, the DRC government does have a similar program, but what we learned is that 99% of artisanal miners avoid those specific tracts of land because the local people know there's no cobalt to be mined. So as soon as the price for cobalt goes up, you literally see artisanal mining moving into very specific areas. And it's important that we remember that everyone involved in the artisanal mining industry, which is probably close to 50 million people globally, they're human beings who are trying to eke out a living, trying to literally provide for their families. And in most places, that's the only way they can do it. So, Zach, let me give you one final question. How do we get President Biden, Deb Haaland, and Jennifer Granholm to northern Minnesota to cut the ribbon on Todd's copper, cobalt, nickel mine and show the United States that the Democratic Party supports responsible mining? I think,
I think they're already there. It's just aligning all those schedules. We can barely get her to stay in the Forrestal building for more than a day. So I can only imagine between her, the president, and secretary, the other secretary would be tough. But I'll say that, this administration is all behind clean energy and doing it responsibly. And I think we're on the way there to rebuild back that social contract and that social trust to keep moving forward.
Yeah, and I'll just finish with one last comment before we go to questions from the audience. If anybody on the call is in any way skeptical about what we call responsible mining, 21st century mining, and how safe it is, both with respect to humans, the safety of the people that work in the mines, please contact Todd and he will arrange for a tour. And I'm very serious when I say this. I've taught thousands of students at the University of Michigan, and I've taken hundreds of them to operating mines, and it is a life-changing event. Everyone has this image in their head of what mining is, and it's antiquated. And the only way I have found to truly change people's perception and opinions of mining is to take them to a mine so they can see what's happening. And importantly, at all mines in the United States, they can literally see the third-party independent contractors who are monitoring everything on the mining property. And all of the data are made public so that the local communities have a complete understanding of the transparency with which the mining company is operating. So with that said, I think we are going to
While you're getting questions, Adam, I used to work, full disclosure, in oil and gas. I'm originally from Texas, right? And so I went to Stanford for an internship, and I was like, oh, clean energy is great. I want to spend the rest of my life doing that. Went to graduate school at Baylor doing geosciences. And of course, oil and gas is what you do as a researcher intern there. And the amount of safety and protocol in that industry is bar none, right? And so I have friends and family that still work in those areas, and I respect them. We don't always see the same eye to eye on where energy resources come from, but I do think that there is a leading edge there in terms of how we do things safely and effectively that they've been doing for decades.
Yeah, and I'll just jump in and make one final comment. One of the things that we often ignore when we talk about the energy transition is the economic importance of oil and gas in many countries around the world. If you take most of the Middle East, North Africa, and you imagine literally turning off oil and gas production, their economies collapse. And oil and gas in those regions, again, if you go back to 1950, one of the leading sources of revenue in Saudi Arabia was the tax that people pay when they make the pilgrimage, the Hajj. And 75, 80 years later, oil dominates their economy, but they're year over year weaning themselves off of that and now investing a lot of money looking for critical minerals. So I think Bill might join us again here, and we'll get to some of the questions proposed by the audience.
Yeah, thanks. I'll jump in here. I really appreciate the discussion, guys. Sorry to start us off here with such a softball, but if the panel could speak to some of the 232 tariffs that have been coming down, that'd be great to hear.
So the question is on the 232 or the maybe also the 301 tariffs that are most recently updated.
Yes, yes.
I'm happy to speak a little bit to that. I mean, the 232 tariffs on steel and aluminum were introduced in the Trump administration, focused on national security, and most of them have been negotiated bilaterally, either by the Trump administration or the Biden administration through import monitoring programs, or, you know, in the Biden administration's case, creating the global arrangement for sustainable steel and aluminum with the EU and the UK, which I guess has been put on hold for now, especially as we get through, you know, election cycles that just finished up in Europe, but then in the United States. And then the 301 tariffs were also begun under the Trump administration. In the context of what we're talking about today, you know, we had some of those on battery materials like lithium carbonate and hydroxide and nickel sulfate, for example. And then and Zach can speak to kind of the update probably more appropriately than me, but, you know, increasing some of the tariffs on the end products, like going to the end product of the EV from, I think, like 27.5% tariff with the MFM tariff up to 100%. And then introducing in tariffs, 301 tariffs on, you know, the raw ores as well. And then we're making reforms to the HTS codes, the harmonized tariff schedule, so that it wasn't so complicated, which is great. Super laud the administration for doing that, because it's not something that I think like constituents maybe appreciate, but industry I think certainly does. And then the introduction of like natural graphite and synthetic graphite tariffs in 2 years from now, which is a well-accompanied kind of commitment to the transition rule that the 30D tax credit included in their final FEOC guidance. And then introduction of tariffs on materials that go into, I guess, aerospace and defense, but also long duration storage. So we don't have the same sourcing provisions affiliated with long duration storage as we do with EV batteries for passenger vehicles per the current tariff schedule, but then also, you know, the tax credit requirements for 30D. So lots there. That could have been a whole webinar, but I think it's a really interesting you know, update by the administration. Really important to kind of reflect the unlevel playing field that we have with China and trying to do that. And then really importantly to emphasize the EU, I think yesterday updated their or provided the final kind of update on their EV subsidy investigation vis-a-vis China. And so they have varying degrees of tariffs that they're imposing on Chinese-made EVs, from like 18% for people who complied with the investigation, companies who complied, and then like up to 38.1%, I think, in the cases of non-compliance or where the subsidies were the highest. And then China said today that they're going to have a dispute in the WTO over the EU's kind of decision there on those tariffs. So juicy trade conversation that's ongoing.
Zach, any thoughts here?
The only thing that I'll add is it goes back to how we started this conversation in terms of change management and security. And what we're thinking about is how do we get a secure, reliable, sustainable supply chain for EVs in this country? And part of that is building reliance on people who share similar values and how we run businesses. And so I think what we've done is we've said, okay, well, here's what we want to do. Here are standards or things that we want to try to implement, and these are the ways that we want to try and do them. It's hard. I mean, I coach kids soccer, and some of them are still using their toe to kick the ball, right? And I'm like, hey, turn your foot, use the inside of your foot, the top of your foot, right? That's hard for them to do because they've never done it. They're just doing it the easy way. It's in front of me, my toes pointing forward, I kick, the ball generally goes forward. Right. But as I show them things and I'm like, here's a better way to do it with more control. That's what I think we're trying to do, is just have a little bit more control over our supply chains. And so by doing these things, it's not easy. I think we all understand that, but there are certain things that we need to do for our national security that are really pushing forward with this.
I think that's a good analogy for a lot of the exploration programs among big mining companies. They are still kicking with their toe.
All right, I appreciate the thoughts on that, Zach. I think this is for you as well. Can you speak to the intergovernmental work going on to help streamline the efforts of the administration? For example, streamlining critical minerals lists.
Yes, and I don't have my colleague Abby Wolf on here, but there is an extensive effort going across, whether it be Interior, U.S. Forest Service, EPA, that is looking specifically at how are we moving forward. It's called the American Battery Materials Initiative. How are we looking across the interagency and in turn with the White House to say what are the efforts that we need to do and what's going to expedite these processes to get us to that clean energy goal. And so I mean, we have one person completely dedicated to this at the Department of Energy who is leveraging all of her resources available to identify not only where's industry at, but where does the government need to meet them so that we can get to the places we need to resource some of these critical materials. And I don't think it's so much agreeing on what the critical materials are, because that's, there are some things that the Department of Defense needs that DOE doesn't, that they deem essential, and vice versa. So it's not necessarily agreeing on what the materials are, but it's really identifying what is the holistic way that we can expedite the process to safely and efficiently retrieve those resources.
I'll just note, we did a webinar with people across the administration who manage these lists to try to explain to people the differences amongst them and how the methodologies, but then also the motivations. So happy to put that in the chat if it gives context to people. And I know Representative Siscomani just introduced a bill to essentially combine the list, particularly DOE's materials list and then USGS's critical minerals list. But it was actually the Energy Act of 2020 that required that both those agencies create their own respective lists, right? So Congress kind of got us into this dynamic, and now we're trying to think through whether it's the most effective way for us to kind of help industry prioritize or reflect government interest or understand supply chain vulnerabilities. And I really can't emphasize enough that there are different, as Zach said, kind of use cases for these minerals. And, the DoD has very, very specific needs for, thermal resistance, technical materials, but there is overlap for some of the most important critical minerals for the energy transition, the dual use minerals. And so that's a really interesting area to explore in terms of where that Venn diagram is kind of, that overlap exists between them, and where we can kind of take advantage of all of DOE's efforts to then support the security of our supply chains, as Todd alluded to at the beginning.
Great. Appreciate the feedback on that. Last question here. Where does the MSP stand with its momentum as the U.S. continues to attempt to form stronger relationships with, quote, like-minded countries? Abigail, I assume this is in your wheelhouse.
Yeah, so SAFE is partnered with the State Department to help infuse private sector advice into the U.S. Critical mineral strategy, but like specifically the diplomatic strategy, and namely to the goals of the Mineral Security Partnership. I think the MSP has done an incredible job of getting people to the table. There's 15 countries, including the European Commission, who are members. They represent half the world's GDP. They're largely consuming countries, largely like-minded countries. Zach kind of talked to the need for approaching like-minded countries and working with them on these resilient supply chains where we can kind of have, trusted relationships where we know there won't be nefarious action like export controls, or some type of like export license where there's gathering of data, where you can kind of issue more specific targeted trade provisions and kind of try to undermine industry. So I think the MSP has done a really good job of building out that group and leveraging them for all of their strengths. I think what remains to be seen is, whether we're going to kind of continue on this journey if there's a change in government, and then hopefully if we, are able to, no matter what, kind of continue the momentum that the MSP has created. They have like 100% turnout rate on their calls, which I think is something that should be completely applauded. And this is a really long-term industry. They make long-term investment decisions. And so we need consistency in government as well as we engage them. And our allies need consistency that the US is going to continue to engage on these issues for economic security, national security, and then for climate change as well. So I'm very bullish on the MSP's prospects. They've made some really great announcements on the public. I think there's about 7 projects on the public list that I would implore people to look at. One of the most recent ones, the U.S. helped facilitate as Secretariat of the MSP, was with Umicore and Gécamines in the DRC to turn germanium from waste products from those mines into germanium concentrate. And really the motive here was to help alleviate the defense industrial base kind of inability to access germanium following the export controls that China had introduced in the tit for tat with chips. And so that's a really good example of us actually putting our money where our mouth is, trying to facilitate these conversations. JOGMEC, Japan's equity arm that has been making investments in these types of projects for over a decade, they also have an MOU with the same project. So again, we're seeing kind of the crowding in of our allies to support these really important critical minerals projects.
Bill, can I just make one follow-up?
Certainly.
For those of us listening, if you look at the current market prices for all critical minerals, copper, cobalt, nickel, lithium, rare earth elements, by the year 2050, it's $10 trillion. And what we really need to ensure that we will have the upstream supply of all these critical minerals is we need investors to put their money into companies that are truly doing revolutionary work exploring for mineral deposits. That's really critical because we have enough metals. I want to make sure everybody understands we have enough copper and nickel and cobalt in the ground. We need to find it and mine it. And so that represents a tremendous opportunity for the investment community to get in early and to help the energy transition.
You know, I honestly hate to jump in because the points that you all have been making in this conversation have been so insightful and important. The only thing I can say is it also leads to the next steps in our series. A number of you talked about responsible mining, which will be the next phase in the Earthshot Minologue series on critical minerals, followed by, and I think, Todd, you mentioned this early on, the discussion about the circular economy and the recycling process. And Adam, you made a very good point about the kind of timeframes associated with it, but of course the significance of it can't be overstated. So, Zach, Todd, Adam, Abigail, can't thank you enough for this conversation. I'd like to remind all of you listening, Our Energy Policy's website has a resource library that has the most extensive collection of reports, papers, studies, etc. We'll be highlighting those on critical minerals and supply chains. So if you are interested in following up on the conversation, reading more about it, please visit our site and go to that resource library. And finally, I just want to thank again our partners, and particularly the Earthshot Foundation, for their support in putting on this program. And I want to wish all of you a good rest of the week and look forward to seeing you at our next event sometime soon. So I'll conclude by once again thanking you, Adam, Abigail, Todd, Zach, for that fantastic discussion. Have a great day.
Thanks,
Thanks
Bill.
so much.